All right. I want to welcome everyone to this webinar on preaching to the vocal opposition, a timely and very critical and intense topic for this webinar today. The topic was inspired by a previous consortium of endowed parishes webinar on preaching, and this panel has been assembled to have a lively conversation about that and to respond to questions at the end. We've got, we'll begin with introductions, and then I'll ask each panelist to respond to questions, and we'll have a discussion among each other. So it's great to know people are watching out there, and it's wonderful to be with this distinguished group of guests. One guest panelist is not here yet, Winnie Varghese. She's from Trinity Wall Street, from the Strategic Global Initiatives. She's on staff there, and she will be joining us as she comes from another engagement. So let me start by introducing Gayle Fisher-Stewart, PhD. She's the rector of St. Luke's Episcopal Church in Washington, D.C. Gayle, we're really happy to have you on this panel.
Glad to be here.
Oh, and the author of this wonderful, the editor of this wonderful new book, Preaching Black Lives Matter, which I recommend to all of you. It's a very rich resource and a tremendous achievement, really. Thank you.
Yeah.
I was just saying, wait, where's the book? Plug the book, plug the book.
Book is right here. I think you might see it backwards. There it is.
There you go. There you go.
There we go. All right. Nikki Mathis is the rector of St. Gregory the Great Episcopal Church in Athens, Georgia. Nikki, it's
yes, I'm Nikki Mathis.
Good to be with you. Chris Rankin-Williams is the rector of St. John's Episcopal Church in Ross, California. Welcome.
Thank you.
And Winnie Varghese, good you got here. Strategic Clergy Global Initiatives, Trinity Church, Wall Street, New York, New York. So welcome, and I look forward to our conversation very much. Let me start out by asking each of you, what made you say yes to this opportunity to be on this panel today? Why don't we start with Nikki? No? Okay. Introduce myself. See, I'm getting the cue cards. Cynthia, I'm Cynthia Briggs Kittredge. I'm the Dean and President of Seminary of the Southwest, and very, very honored to be among you. You know, when I get ready to teach, I always have to put a note to myself, write name on board. So that's what I'm doing, introducing myself. Okay, Nikki, why don't you say?
I'm Nikki Mathis from St. Gregory the Great in Athens, Georgia. So I am below the Mason-Dixon line, and that was my son that you just saw, which was why I couldn't answer the first time. And I am very, very glad to be here. This is just a conversation that we can't not have. That's why I wanted to be here today. It's, if we're going to preach the gospel, we have to preach about the fact that that injustice and a sin over 400 years old has been what this country has been founded on in part. And we can't skate over that and think we're doing the gospel justice.
Great. Thank you for being here. Gayle?
I too want to thank you for this invitation, and I'm just fascinated by the group. It's amazing how long you've been Episcopalian and not know what SEEP is. And then when you find out what it is, you go, well, how many congregations of color are part of SEEP, right? and the other thing is that the title acknowledges that the Episcopal Church is not all on one accord, and that is to be expected. And we like to fool ourselves that we're kind of liberal on all issues, but that is a myth. And it's a false narrative that we need to dispel and acknowledge that there are some people in our pews who believe in white supremacy. And once we admit that, we can begin to create a new narrative that we can actually work with. And the title also reminded me of a sermon I preached a couple of years ago at the Diocesan Clergy Conference, not mine, that was dealing with justice and peace building in the Episcopal Church. And so I was supposed to give the closing sermon, and my sermon was, "Who lynched Willie Earl?" Of course, there were like, there were 200 clergy, and there were 4 of us down front, and me in the pulpit, right? And so I took for my text Matthew 22, 37 through 40, where, you know, you love your neighbor as yourself. And I borrowed the title from a book by the same name by retired Methodist Bishop Will Willimon. And there's a book about preaching on confronting racism. And so just briefly, because it kind of fits in all of this, in 1947, a Black man named Willie Earl was lynched in Greenville, South Carolina. And a Methodist pastor, Holly Lynn, was 31 years old, fresh out of seminary, first assignment, newly widowed with an infant, and totally dependent on the congregation for everything: food, cleaning, watching the kid, living in the parsonage. And he was incensed that the good Christians of his church were not even fazed that a human being had been lynched. And he started asking folks, like, do you know what happened? And they were going like, you know, why are you bothered with that? That was over there. That has nothing to do with us. He even went to his counsel and they said, you know, you don't need to touch that. You know, it could be dangerous to touch that. And so long story short, he couldn't deal with the hypocrisy. And so he made a decision that he was going to preach about that lynching, even if it cost him everything. And it could have cost him everything. And so March 2nd, 1947, he mounted that pulpit and announced his sermon topic, which was "Who lynched Willie Earl?" And in 1947, he specifically connected racism and lynching, and he contrasted the oppressive world in which Willie Earl lived with the world in which the white folks lived. And then as he ended, he preached, he said, the Negro would not forever allow white supremacist tyranny to continue. That was 1947. And here we are today. And so he risked everything. And so I connected that if you're going to preach a changed church, a changed world, you're going to have to be able to get used to risking it. And it depends on how much you are actually willing to risk to preach a gospel that says, we don't have to live like this. And so this whole conversation is just fascinating to me. So I'm glad to be here.
Thank you, Gayle. It's good to have you. Chris, would you introduce yourself?
Sure. Hey, everybody. I'm Chris Rankin-Williams. I'm the rector at St. John's Church in Ross, California, which is in Marin County. So we're just north of San Francisco. Very white, very suburban church in Marin County. The main reason I said yes was because when I saw who else they were asking to be on the panel, I thought, wow, how cool to get to hang out and talk with those amazing women. So that's the main reason I said yes. The second one is probably with all the work that's been going on since George Floyd's death or murder. I've had my own experience of working with the vocal opposition in my congregation. So when I saw it, I thought, oh, I just went through that, or I am in that. So that's the main reason. The other reason I said yes.
Thank you. Winnie.
Yeah, so yes, and yes. And so good to be here and to be with these amazing people. So sort of assumed in your question also is, whose work is it, right? And so I want to, why do this and who should do this? I was in the Diocese of Los Angeles, and was where I know Chris from. And the first parish I was in had remnants of the Reagan administration in it because Mr. Reagan was dying in that parish at the time. And so right out of seminary, the question of what we're doing in our pulpits was presented to me in a way that I wasn't ready for, frankly. I had not come from churches like that. But the urgency, I think, in this moment is, as you all probably saw at John Lewis's funeral on Thursday, the great James Lawson, who was also in Los Angeles when we were there, said this, that Christian love has power, untapped, that could change not only our own lives, but the world. So he's quoting Martin Luther King Jr. And I really do believe this is the work of our salvation as the church and as Americans. It's not optional. So that doesn't mean it shouldn't be considered and strategic, or that it might not be difficult depending on where you are. And it is the work of generations, but it is a profoundly spiritual and political work. And I don't think it's optional.
Mhm.
Thank you. Thank you all for saying yes. And Winnie's comment that this is critical, non-optional work. Really what we're talking about is how to be effective and how to do this work most effectively. And one of the key elements in preaching, of course, is the relationship between the preacher and the congregation. And that dynamic can be so different depending on who and where you are. So the first thing I wanted to ask you all is if you could reflect a little bit on your own social location and identity in relation to your congregation or the congregations you've been in, and how that plays into how you think about this question. And why don't I just go backwards and start with Winnie on this one?
So I'm an Episcopal priest in New York City. I was ordained in Los Angeles, and I've only worked in those two cities. I was born and was raised and educated in Dallas, Texas, where it was not an option for me to be ordained or to work. My parents are from India. They're from the Indian Orthodox Church. We are members of that church by heritage, and I'm baptized into those churches. We are now first-generation Anglicans. Trinity Church is an intentionally racially diverse congregation and staff. We are also politically diverse, but lean towards inclusivity and social justice, especially on racial justice, as a result of the racial diversity in the congregation, which draws people who choose to be in a racially diverse congregation. So we are later to the game on gender equality and sexual orientation, but we're making progress at Trinity. And my heritage is within a self-confident, ancient local church in a multi-religious society in which we are a minority. And that church expects to influence the community it serves within. So on the one hand, as piety for the believer, how we all think about who we are in our hearts, but also with a vision for a just society, but within a multi-faith context. So within that, that's not about converting everyone around us. That is about what are the values for society. And I find as I get older, how much I am very much a product of my parents' heritage. Not so much the churches in suburban Dallas that I grew up in, but that I expect the church to have something to say to the world. And I find myself in a part of the church that expects the church to have something to say and to have some impact in its neighborhood.
Thank you. Chris, what about you?
So, so I'm straight white male that has, my whole ministry has been in two parishes that were in very wealthy white suburban communities. I grew up in the only non-Mormon family in a neighborhood in Salt Lake City, Utah, which was pretty formative. I had a very early experience of being excluded because I wasn't Mormon, but obviously all my other privileges carried beyond that. So my context now is, one, it's very clear to me that, you know, I wouldn't be the rector of St. John's Ross if at least when I was applying 17 years ago, if I wasn't a straight white male, I wouldn't be sitting in this office right now. And I hope we're doing really good work as a congregation that would, you know, hopefully change that. The setting I'm in is kind of fascinating in Marin. Marin's really kind of the home of spiritual, but not religious. So, you know, the Mount Tam, the birthplace of mountain biking, and like I'm looking at it out my window right now. So it's very kind of out focused, very low per capita church, synagogue, mosque attendance, but very high spiritual, but not religious. The Spirit Rock Meditation Center is nearby. So there's a context in which it feels really cool because it's almost countercultural here. I mean, everywhere, but to be religious, kind of in the context of Marin, where most people, you know, I don't really go to church. I find God on Mount Tam, and I find God on Mount Tam too. But what I don't get when I go on bike rides with my friend is any talk about engaging social justice or work in the community or poverty or whatever while we're riding around on our expensive bikes. So That's kind of my context. Marin, I would say, is mostly a liberal, it's known as being fairly progressive and liberal, but certainly has plenty of conservative people too. And the congregation I'm in has a mix of, I'd say it's not that much, it's got some economic diversity, but it has more, I would say, age and political diversity, if you can call that diverse. But it's in an extremely wealthy town within Marin County. So that's my context. My previous church was All Saints by the Sea in Montecito. So as one of my non-state clergy refers to us as apostles to the overprivileged.
Thank you. Gayle.
I am a Black female who questions church, but not God, who came to ordained ministry late. Paul and Murray and I were about the same age when ordained to the priesthood. I come as a former police officer and educator, and now pastor a church for just a little while longer that was founded by Alexander Crummell, a Black priest with a Pan-African bent who died disappointed with the state of race relations in this country and this church. St. Luke's, DC is a historically Black church, the first independently designed, financed, and constructed Black church in the Diocese of Washington. We still worship in that sanctuary that was built. And it's an aging building and has all the issues aging buildings bring. We pride ourselves on having been and continue to be, in some instances, the Episcopal Church of the upper crust Black folks in DC. And if you find somebody who's been there long enough, they will tell you when the pews in this Black church were segregated by color. The lighter you were, the closer you sat to the front. And it took a pastor who realized that if he was a member, he'd be sitting in the back to say, we're not going to do this any longer. And so those ghosts are still there. We find ourselves exiled in our own land because gentrification is taking over. And as we see our members grow older, and we know that whites in general do not affiliate with predominantly Black churches, while Blacks will affiliate with predominantly white churches, we're asking ourselves, okay, well, where is our mission field and how do we evangelize? And so we constantly ask ourselves, where is the gospel message in all of this? And ultimately, how long can we or will we survive as a church?
Thank you. Nikki.
I am at St. Gregory the Great, Athens, which is the second Episcopal church in Athens, Georgia. It started off 50 years ago as a mission to the larger, wider, richer church. And we have some economic diversity, but I think it's me and 4 other people that make up the persons of color in our congregation. And there's a desire to learn more, but and also I am one of 2 female Black rectors in the diocese, despite the hard work of diocesan search consultants who have tried to get some of our congregations to widen to the notion that Jesus was not necessarily white and married with 2.4 kids and male, that Jesus can be seen in all peoples, in all faces, in all colors, in all lives. And that hasn't yet gotten through some of the 4th province, and so as much as it has in other parts of the country, but we're working on it. The first Black woman rector was hired in this diocese in 2018. I was 2019, so this is all still very, very recent. So our work is kind of framed by the fact that getting to the vocal opposition is actually, for me anyway, vocal opposition has been easier to deal with than non-vocal, simply because I know what I'm dealing with, as opposed to, no, we're good, it's not racial. But I was like, but I don't see any other rectors, including in our historically Black churches, because the diocese does have some. And so there's, as Mother Gayle was mentioning, sometimes it's in our own pews that that there's some work to be done around who gets to be at and closest to the altar, in terms of who's in the pulpit and who's up front and who's doing the magic hands in front of the cross behind the altar.
Thank you. Well, that's an amazingly diverse landscape of contexts and ways of coming at this question in the different places you are. Let me ask another question. In approaching this question of preaching to the vocal opposition, how would you describe and diagnose the partisan environment that we're living in terms of politics, or the divided times in which we live, and the impact of those on your preaching the gospel? And we'll do just volunteer for this, and I'll make sure everyone answers it. How would you define and diagnose the partisan times, the divided times, and how does it affect you and your work?
I'll go. We are called to preach the gospel in season and out of season. We are not preaching politics as politics is known, and all too often, politics is anything that is opposite of what somebody sitting in the pew agrees with.
Right.
Right? That's what the politics is. And again, it goes back to whether or not we are here to maintain the institutional church, and that's where the risk comes in. Again, why are we here? Why were we called? What are we supposed to be doing? Or are we here as the body of Christ, and we want people to follow Jesus into the margins where those who are denied full humanity will be found? You know, those who are denied their fair share of God's creation. And one of the things is that if we do as we are called to do, and we are willing to take that risk, I'm reminded of a quote by Father Daniel Berrigan from the 60s, Vietnam War area. He says, if you're going to follow Jesus, you better look good on wood, because that's where people will put you. And in fact, it's easy if you just carry your own cross so that you can get up on it periodically. And so we really have to wonder whether we're more concerned with the institutional church having all these buildings and looking pretty and doing the magic hands, or are we there to really get people to understand, no, this is about Jesus. And if you're about following Jesus, it's going to be a rough ride. It is not easy. And so you need to get used to being uncomfortable. And part of our job is also to make you feel uncomfortable, because we're just putting the word out there, and the word can be and is often uncomfortable.
And I've always, the divide, as we like to term it, it's never not been there. The country was founded on it, as far as I'm concerned. It's just that those who used to be voiceless now have voices. And so that's where some of the partisanship can be seen to come from. But it's not that it was never there. It was just that one side was very, very, very oppressed and dominated by white supremacy. And it's not that the divide isn't white and white, or this and that, or that and the other, but the 50s and the 40s may have had more of a vision of being not as partisan, but that was also, there was just, white supremacy had more of a voice. But as Mother Stewart just said, lynchings were happening, killings were happening, rapes were happening. It was none of the stuff that was a tool of oppression wasn't happening then and just started happening now. It's always been. It's just that folks now tend to pick a side and get there and talk about, no, we shouldn't rape, no, we shouldn't sell people, no, we shouldn't be having sex with children, no, we shouldn't be lynching people, no, we shouldn't be shooting little black boys and girls in a park because they playing with something that looks like it might be a gun. I don't know, I've always been confused by the characterization that our world is so partisan now, because I don't know when it wasn't.
Yeah, and to that point, first of all, I thought I followed Berrigan a bit, but I've never heard that quote before. It's fantastic, and it has stayed with me. So thank you for that. I found it really helpful that Michelle Alexander recently has said, the resistance is not BLM, it's not Black Lives Matter. The resistance is white supremacists and neo-Nazis. And what she points to is that Americans still overwhelmingly poll as more liberal than conservative, Democrat than Republican, more populist, and concerned with the basic goods of life, a fair wage, affordable housing, good education. What we see in our politics, I think, is that Wall Street has different values. The value of the stock market, where money can be skimmed off and out of the overall economy. The divide is among the populist base on how we get to that decent life for most of us. And I think politicians use the tools at hand, and racism is one of them. But the unrest that is so easy to tap into and weaponize is the generational disenfranchisement of the average American. And that there's no sign of that ending. And so I think we're using the tool we have, and it's a horrible tool. But what Michelle Alexander says actually points more correctly to what we know about how people poll and their values, and the really small percentage of us that vote, and then that small percentage of that amount that what determines who's winning in elections. And I point to the elections because in 2016, I would say at 2016 at Trinity Church, it became really clear how to speak to these issues in a way that before the election, we had to be a lot more careful. There's still a lot of vocal opposition. We get a lot of feedback. I get a lot of feedback, but its character is different after the election, and the exposure of a certain kind of really base and public form of sexism and racism that absolutely existed before, right? But existed discreetly and politely. And the exposure of that did something to our congregation and our leadership, where there was space to be much more clear and direct. And I wonder if that is the experience of some others as well.
It's interesting experience at St. John's. I mean, there's certainly a vocal opposition group that at this point is mainly what I would say is people sort of 65 or 70 and older, who tend to be more conservative. And we've been trying to work on issues around racial justice and white privilege, and removing the flags from the chancel when we did our renovation. And that's, that over time, that has always triggered the kind of, separation of church and state, which drives me crazy, because that's not actually what it's about, but that gets used, right? So I think part of the context is, and one of our challenges as a church is so many of us are operating out of our political ideology, not as disciples of Jesus. And so trying to bring up political issues in a way that's not explicitly partisan, but is trying to engage the conversation. But something has really shifted this time. I mean, first there was a huge Black Lives Matter event in this very white suburban town, people putting signs all over the lawn of the church because they couldn't put them at the school, people of all ages engaging. But what really shifted, and I want to thank Winnie and Stephanie and Kelly Brown Douglas so I'll tell you a little story. So one of the things we've been trying to do is I can talk about racism and white privilege, but we've been really trying to get people in this congregation to listen to the voices of people of color. And I can preach and I'll get a little bit of pushback, but I shared the Speaking of Freedom letter in that Winnie helped in our weekly email. And wow, like the reaction was really very strong from a very vocal opposition. And what happened in saying, look, we need to listen to the voices of women of color or people of color, instead of just me talking about it or other people in the parish talking about it, is part of what's happening is the conversation is switching from racism to whiteness and talking about whiteness. And the phrase white supremacy really set a lot of people off. And so I just think it's fascinating that what's really creating the opposition is not all of us nice white people trying to figure out how to stay in relationship and talk about racism, but actually listening to the voices of people who aren't white talk about it. And that has been a huge shift. And there's still, I mean, you would not believe the emails I got. I got an email from my senior warden who grew up in Dallas, who's in his 40s. He's like, I love this letter. I'm going to read it to my kids. Like the next 6 emails I got were just, pretty outrageous, some of them. And I was like, wow, this has really uncovered some stuff that I didn't even know was really there. Like there's been vocal opposition, but this just took it to a whole new level. Of course, we're in a challenging time. And so it's trying to stay in relationship with people regardless of their politics. But so on one hand, there's people operating out of bringing their politics into their faith, not the other way around, which is part of what we're trying to preach, but also people like me having to really deal with whiteness and not the safe distance of talking about racism, but actually talking about whiteness and white supremacy. And that is shifting the focus in a really important way. And, it's stirring stuff up, but it's really important and really good.
It's interesting to think about the different periods. You mentioned Winnie just after 2016, and now we're in this other period. Black Lives Matter had a certain resonance in certain places in 2016 that's different. It's expanded so much now. And white supremacy is even something you can talk about in a place like Chris's parish in a way that I don't think you could have even 3 years ago. So that's really fascinating. When we had our preliminary discussion among us to prepare for this, one of the things that came up strongly was the importance of pastoral relationship, that precedes any efficacy in being a prophetic preacher. And many of you talked about that tension. And I wanted to ask you, how do you live in that tension? How do you, bury the family of the same person that sent you the nasty email? How do you stay in relationship with people that have insulted you or hurt you? Anyway, how do you live in that tension? And what do you find has worked for you? I think, everybody's in their own situation with this challenge. And I'd just love to know something that's worked for you.
And I think it's going to be different depending on the gender and the color you come to the pulpit with,
Mm-hmm.
and the gender and the color of the people in your congregation. Mine hired me in a time and space when there's only 2 of us. There's not at this church, there's only 2 of us in the diocese. And so there are folks for whom that's a little difficult, and it's a change. And there are some for who are like, yay. And talking about the fact that isms, racism, sexism, are all flying in the face of white patriarchal supremacy. And that's a hard seat. That's a hard power to give up. it's a hard, when folks have, what's the saying, when folks are used to experiencing privilege, equality feels like oppression. And trying to walk folks through that. And Athens is blue, and my congregation is very blue as far as almost all, a lot of Democrats. There's some Republicans, but a lot of Democrats. And the Republicans were the ones that were feeling pushed aside, and even with the, even in the current political climate, even after 2016. And so that was more so about making sure that everybody was clear that Jesus was here loving absolutely everybody. And we're real, when I preach about love, I'm real clear about that. Love isn't being nice. Love is being honest. Love is having boundaries. Love is being kind, but that kindness also requires honesty. And so, so when we were able to say, you know, regardless of who you voted for, Jesus loves you, regardless of what bumper stickers on your car, Jesus loves you, regardless of whether you think you're racist or not, Jesus loves you. And being able to live that out and having everybody come to the table. And then as a Black woman in the pulpit, being able to say to the search committee and to the vestry before I got here, it's not my job to teach racism. It's not my job to teach you about race. My job is to be your pastor and your priest. I will facilitate the other things if you're ready for that, because that's going to be hard work and it's going to be your work, but it's not mine. And Black people aren't going to come just because I'm in the pulpit. And they were open to that. And also after George Floyd's murder, and I was just devastated and soaking in all the stuff of all that was going on, I said, I can't preach to y'all right now. And I can't talk to folks, right? I can't write the weekly letters. I can't do it. And the vestry was, and you know, I got a couple of whys, and I said, I can't attend to the wound on your knee with I've got a knife in my back. And so they were able to hear that, and I, you know, people were able to come in, and you know, the vestry was able to take over the weekly letters. I took a break as far as being present, and then when I was ready, I was able to come back and be minister to everybody, regardless of where they were. But and that was, and because we'd already been talking about it, that is love and discipleship. Me caring for folks for whom, well, it's the norm for everybody that's in the U.S. at least. White supremacist systems are the norm while I'm bleeding doesn't help anybody. And so being able to say that, and also being able to get other people to do the work they say they want it done, which they were true to it. They said, yes, we want to work on, so we got people in to begin to talk about whiteness, to begin to talk about how you don't have to be what some would term racist in order to be a supporter of white supremacy. Now, my term of racism is very simple. It's race plus power. So that pretty much, so whether or not you're biased doesn't mean you're not racist. Whether or not you're biased doesn't mean you're not sexist. Whether or not you're homophobic, I mean, whether or not you're straight or gay doesn't mean you're not homophobic. It just depends on what group I myself belong to, and whether I have the power to then oppress some other people, either by contribution or complicity or outright active power. And we've had that discussion as well. And that's all part of it. That's all part of, and all this can't happen in the pulpit. It has to happen in the pulpit plus the newsletters, plus Sunday school, plus this, plus that, plus the action of folks who are in the congregation, including myself. This is a lived gospel. So if we're only preaching it, it's not going to really work well.
Nikki, I'm really struck by the leadership you showed by being so vulnerable and telling people you couldn't do it. I mean, that's amazingly courageous, I think, for a Episcopal clergy person, who, well, when the model is always to be in control and always have it together and all that. That's amazing.
Well, thank you. I've got a healthy church. I couldn't do that. There are other places I could not have done that. But also that's also some of the, since this is the topic that we're discussing, that's also part of the preaching moment.
Yeah.
Part of being in the pulpit is preparing folks for when this stuff is going to come, because it's going to come. And so if you aren't already talking about love and discipleship in very real, practical ways, the suddenly talking about racism or any ism and oppressive power structures isn't going to work, because people are going to get hurt. People are going to as it's already been stated, people are going to feel uncomfortable, and letting folks know up front after you tell them, I love you, Jesus loves you, it's all good. Now we're going to all feel uncomfortable together. Here we go.
Thank you. Anybody else on that tension?
I wonder, for the church at large, if the tension is really an issue. That if you are ordained, you ought to be able to go anywhere, as opposed to maybe we are supposed to be able to go anywhere, but that's not how it works. And whether or not, where you have people of color going into a situation, and of course for the Episcopal Church, majority of the situations, we're going to be outnumbered, way outnumbered. Whether or not the first or the only is part of a social experiment. So that after this is over, we can say, see, we're not racist, we're not sexist, we're not homophobic, because we've had the first Black president, so we're post-racial. So, so how is the church ready to provide brave space where those types of topics can really come up? Because as a result of writing the book, I've had conversations with clergy of color, and they are the only, they don't even have their family with them. They're just it. And they said it is rough. The other side of that is, okay, since George Floyd, it's been like Black History Month. Right? All the people of color are now in great demand again. Right? What happened? I'm serious, right? I have a seminary professor. She tells him, if you can't call me in September, don't call me in February. I'm not coming. So, now that we're talking, oh, well, who can come? And okay, but what happens later on? Because we're not seeing as many folks in the streets. And eventually we'll get back to some weird pandemic normal, where we're going to have church as we had it. And so, yes, we have our social experiment. We can put a little badge up that we're not something, as opposed to the church, if it's really serious about whatever it's going to call it, in terms of eliminating the isms and the phobias, to be able to really talk about this in a way that enables folks who are in these situations to truly feel that there's somebody who has my back, as opposed to somebody putting a knife in my back.
I worked in the church once where right after I got there, one of the wardens said, you'll never be my spiritual leader, and then proceeded to just take the categories of my identity and say, you are this, 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 where else are you going to work? This is a Christian man who was a warden in an Episcopal church, right? An influential Episcopal church. And it was just what I appreciated about it is he was saying what a lot of people think, right? That you're a token, that we're kind of filling a space for a while. And it was a little bit useful, frankly, for me to not assume that we weren't all going to smile and pretend it wasn't there. And what I find interesting about this question, Cynthia, is I found pastoral work actually to be very hard. Most of it is hard, right? That you got to tell somebody that they can't drive their car anymore, which means you're going to be isolated. Or you got to tell them they really need to go to a nursing home and your kids can't figure out how to tell you to do it, so I've got to do it, or you're in the hospital and you're not going home after this, right? Like, I feel like I've had to do a lot of those and they break my heart. So not to undo the reality of structural racism, but I feel like pastoral work is really hard. And we tell people hard things. We say, friend, what you have is called addiction, and we're going to be finding a way to do something about this because you're destroying your life and your family. Like, we've all done that, and we do that, and we train to do it, and we do it, right? And we survive it, and we fail sometimes, but we do it. I think, like, at least I do. I think we all do this. So I don't know how this, frankly, again, not to undo the seriousness of structures of racism, but I actually don't know how this is any harder than some of those heartbreaking things that we have personally done with people. The difference is that we don't all agree as in consensus that this is probably good for that person or good for the community. And the difference is it can happen in a pulpit. And the reason it needs to happen in a pulpit is it puts it in the framework of the gospel. And we need to do that. It cannot just be the session on the side. It needs to be the session on the side. It needs to be the book studies and the conversations. All those things need to happen. And it needs to be in the pulpit, right? That because we do not as a nation attach our morality to our position on racism and to our anti-racism, and we should. And we're not going to do that quickly. And that part of the Episcopal tradition, part of our heritage, is we teach from the pulpit. If we don't lead and teach that from the pulpit, it can't happen in the rest of the system. But the rest of the system needs that work as well. The other end of that would be the pulpit's not enough. But that framing, it's why I find Michelle Alexander's work so interesting in this, is it's a lot of content and teaching as a way to understand what's happening around us, that if we don't have it, we can't hope that people intuit it and their goodness will intuit the right next steps. They're being inundated with the opposite message all the time, or a different message all the time. And it's our work to create content, right? That is what we, to teach correctly, to teach well, to discern together, and to put that, like, our job is to kind of place that up against the gospel and test it, right? And if we don't do that, I think it's a lot to assume that our congregations are going to do that on their own and bring it to us, and then we can do it when we all agree.
Very, very interesting to break down the binary between pastoral and prophetic. Really interesting. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I find that I think the whole pastoral prophetic thing is especially complicated, maybe complicated by COVID, especially. There was a really good article put out, I think it was by the Praxis group, about, is COVID kind of a blizzard, a winter, or an ice age for the church and for other institutions? Now, the group that put it out, it's a great article. I mean, it's a very white male group, so I want to be clear about that. But they had a really interesting line that they said for church leaders in the context of COVID, I even have it here on my screen all the time. Our most important resource is trust in the context of love. And I think at least for leaders like me, it's an intentional decision to trade on some of that trust to address whiteness and white supremacy. You've got to say, like, all right, there's this trust. I've worked hard to build up this trust. And I've tried to say, we can disagree with stuff, but we can be bound in Jesus in ways that all that. But you do kind of have to trade on a little bit of that trust, and it's worth it. But I'm also finding that, granted, the vocal opposition is a minority in the congregation, but I'm also finding that, like, when you've got to put out the prophetic voice, hopefully this isn't cowardice on my part, and I hope you'll all call me out if it is. Like, you got to put out a little bit of that prophetic voice about talking about our whiteness and white supremacy. But you've also got to be doing the work to reinforce the trust, right? Like, I'm still going to come see you in the hospital. I still love you. We can disagree on this, but it doesn't mean I'm not your priest or how we do all that. and part of the vocal opposition, right? I mean, at least in my context, where it's mainly older people, they're all isolated at home, right? So like the one safe place to kind of express stuff might be the church. I also just think that COVID is amplifying all the multidimensional things that are going on. I mean, there's a whole generational shift going on right now, right? Like I think it was last year or the year before was the first year that boomer clergy started hitting the mandatory retirement age. So you've got that shift going on. Last year was the first year where millennials became a larger part of the population than boomers. Like there's a whole generational dynamic playing out. And if you look at who's leading a lot of these protests, I love the phrase I keep hearing about, I'm all on board on, we've got to, I think, some of us in one of our pre-meetings were talking about, we just need to stop being chaplains of empire. But I love the phrase, not being chaplains of empire, but sort of prophets of the resistance. I don't think me or my congregation are going to be prophets of the resistance, but we need to try to listen to those prophets, right? I mean, it wasn't St. John's Episcopal Church leading marches in Marin City. It was the youth of Marin City, which is a predominantly Black area in Marin. It was the youth in those communities that were leading those things. And so there's a big generational shift too. And I think, at least in my context, where you have very privileged white people, boomer, silent generation, who are now nearing retirement, or the power dynamics are shifting. And I think this is all playing out in the conversation around race in the church, for sure.
Thank you. I think we might shift now to one of a question or two from the chat box, from the comments, people who are listening. This was a specific one, and it kind of relates to, what might work. And that's this one. Can you address this idea, the limit and the benefit of the sermon that's usually a one-way communication? Has any of you worked to increase additional communication settings where these topics and ideas can be discussed so that there's the capacity for conversation? With the idea that the sermon that reaches more fertile soil and people who have ears attuned to listening might be more effective.
I think it's an opportunity to put the message out there. And it's amazing, some of the conversations I've seen on Facebook concerning sermons is more about length than
oh yeah,
right, than substance. And I'm going, okay, you're concerned about length as opposed to substance. But if the message is there, you can listen for an hour. If the message is not there, 10 minutes is too long. But I think the other opportunities at a church I came from, what we would do after we preached, we came down to the floor and asked for questions.
Oh.
And sometimes that went longer than the service.
Mm-hmm.
But people have questions, and they want to, as you're preaching, they want to go like, and you go like, no, I can't do that. So we gave them the opportunity right after the sermon to have a conversation and to ask questions. Now, some will do that in a forum after the service. But I think we have to provide an opportunity for folks to question and push back on what we're saying, or to get clarification, as opposed to just leaving and, okay, I have to figure this out on my own. So it goes to how are we willing to experiment with how we do liturgy and service, and whether or not we're constrained with a certain amount of time, or what is it that we really want people to experience as a part of this worship? What do we want them to go away with? And so if we are willing to try different things and ask for questions and get some pushback, and maybe that part takes a little bit longer, so they're still in church or online for a few minutes longer. Because sometimes people leave with a lot of unanswered questions from the sermon.
Thank you.
Pre-COVID, some of those questions, well, at least my folks, because they weren't shy, would ask those questions at the door. But now one of the few gifts that COVID has brought is that the service and the sermon is pre-recorded, so I'm able to be chatting online, and folks ask questions. If their question comes up, this in the chat, and I get to answer it, or somebody else will answer it. And that's been one of the beautiful things, because for probably 50% of the questions, somebody else is answering.
Wow.
And so it's a whole conversation about what's going on in the sermon. Now we haven't had, I will know things have moved, that the needle has moved when folks feel brave enough and safe enough to start asking questions about complicity, when they start asking questions about whiteness, when they start asking questions about patriarchy. I will know that we've gotten beyond just intellectualizing, and that we've moved to trying to live, that it's gone from our head to our gut. But the starting point of the conversation is there. And as far as making other spaces, again, from my location as a Black woman in a largely white parish, I'm not the one who should be running the racial teaching. And so I bring in other people, they do that. And then there'll come a time when either we've reached some kind of saturation point, or I see a need to step in, and then I'm able to have a conversation, because they will have gone through the first step of addressing whiteness. There's no point in me talking, except as myself, for myself, regarding as far as teaching, until whiteness has been addressed among my white congregants.
Thank you. I want to, this might be the last question. We'll see how much time we have, but it's pulling together one of our questions and some of the things that I've seen in the chat. And it's about your sense of responsibility to the loyal opposition. And it seems to be, who are they? How much effort to go to? Is that the way to even phrase the question? Should you just let it go? Is it part of the risk that Gayle was referring to at the beginning? So how do we think about this? Is our parish divided into groups, and is there a loyal opposition, and what's our responsibility to it? Or would you phrase the question differently? That's that pulls together some of the things that are in the chat also. Some people say, don't bother. It's not good way to spend your energy.
I think it's important to remember that no one is static, and no one has only one input. So we recently did we're putting together a campaign on people coming out of prison and reentry systems in New York, which are a mess. And one of the colleagues that we called to join the campaign said, "Oh, thank God for your call. My kids are giving me such grief about not using my power and my voice in this moment. I'm not marching. I'm not, we're not leading." Which that was hilarious, because we wouldn't have necessarily called this person, right? It was a little bit of a stretch of a call in some ways, a wonderful person. But interesting, right? That he's getting feedback from his family that he isn't stepping up. And he is someone who has not stepped up or stepped in on these issues in the role that he's in historically, that I've known him. But so would we have even known, right, if we hadn't appeal to him, that that things are stirring in his family in a way that are working at his conscience? So we are all seeing all these inputs in different ways, and absolutely some people are entrenched, but sometimes that entrenchedness is coming from some other feedback somewhere else, right? So I think if you're going to take my take on this, that this is the work of our salvation, right? That this is a formation kind of work. You don't do 1 week on stewardship, you guys. Like, you guys are in it all the time. We're trying to form people, right? And we're doing that during the week. We're doing it on weekends. We're doing it in fun ways. We're doing it in heavy ways. because it's a lot of new information. And I actually think there's a huge teaching role in preaching. It's not complete. It's not just shouting at people from up front, unless you like that. Like some people are really good at that. But the point is actually that it's a work of formation. So I don't think you speak to the lowest common denominator, because that's insulting to the community. I always assume that my community is where I am, that we are together and we're learning together. So I don't have wisdom from on high to share, but we are questioning and learning together. And if we are walking away with more skill at what questions to ask the issues of the world and the issues of the day and the text, then we're growing together. But I do think it is a danger to assume I know what's going to push someone's buttons, and we're going to stay clear of that, and we're going to stay in this zone over here. I think it's the pulpit it's not worthy of the pulpit.
Thank you.
And I don't think it's not our job to include them, because they're already included. God determines who's in and out. Mm-hmm. It's whether or not they want to accept that invitation to remain included and to participate in a different type of world in which everybody is lifted up. And so we put it out there. I mean, Jesus says, if I be lifted up, I will draw people unto me. So Jesus offers the invitation. And if people want to accept, it's on them. So it's not for us to determine who's in and out. I don't like you, I like you. We tell the truth, as it has been said, in love. It's an open invitation, and people have to see some value for themselves in that invitation. And if they're more wedded to a way of life that they exclude themselves, that's really on them. But it's an open invitation for anybody to participate. So it's not up to us to try to convince. It's up to folks to accept.
And also to that.
Go ahead.
Just adding to that point, since the invitation is already there, part of what I see as my job as pastor and priest is to invite them in for a talk, and not a talk to convince them of anything. Let me listen to you. Where have you been? What is your life story? So that I can understand what some of these things are, and not to button push, but to go, oh, okay. All right. Okay. So I get it. You don't agree with this, or you don't agree with, later on after we've had our discussions and our coffee and our what have you. And I know you don't agree with such and such, but I know you love this church. I know you love Jesus. How about you run the coffee makers? How about you, I know you're not planning on coming to the march, but do you mind making some of the signs? Because that story, and I don't know who said it, but the story about the convent where there was half of the nuns that wanted to go out and work on some social justice stuff, and half the nuns didn't agree, thought they should be cloistered, and the Mother Superior said, fine, we don't have to agree, but we're all going to work together. So those of you who need to march, go march. Those of you who aren't marching, go pray and make sandwiches and make coffee. We ain't got to talk about Jack Diddley when folks get back about this if you don't want to, but we are going to be one house. Well, and that's the church. We are one house. We don't have to agree on everything altogether. We don't have to, and it's not my job to transform anybody. That's Jesus' work. Mm-hmm. Jesus will, on Jesus' timetable, see if somebody changes from this, we change from glory to glory. And Nikki Mathis has never changed anybody from anybody's glory to any other glory. But if I'm faithful to my work, I've seen Jesus change people from glory to glory. And so it's more about getting out of the way, and not about not saying stuff or saying stuff to push somebody's button. You just preach the gospel, preach the truth, preach what there is to preach. And then folks will take up invitations or not take up invitations, just as was said. But my job is to also make sure there's space for them. Not in stuff we don't adhere to, or don't, the Klan meeting cannot meet here. But if they're still part of the community, those members are still part. We don't have any Klan members, just to be clear, so that nobody writes St. Gregory's. But some people, there's something they can do that lets them still be part of the family of God without having to go so far out of their zone of what they're willing to be, that they have to hop up and get out. And that's part of the job of leadership, is to make sure there's space for as many people as possible, in my view anyway.
In my context, I think my sort of vocal opposition already assumes they're included in the kingdom and in the church. It's doing the work with them to see that maybe they're not the ones that write the terms of that inclusion, right? I mean, that's the privilege that needs to be challenged, and to look at what does inclusion really mean, and we're not the ones that should be defining it, and that really pushes up against privilege. I mean, part of the reaction to, that Speaking of Freedom letter, like, it wasn't an angry letter, but there was some rawness to it. And I was saying to my wife, I said, I think part of this reaction is like, all these white people cannot handle the emotions, these authentic emotions from these people of color. It was almost like, well, we're the only ones that are allowed to be aggrieved. Like, what is going on here? So I think that's part of the dynamic. I'm also just deeply grateful for my vocal opposition, because they're vocal. I mean, I love what Nikki said earlier, right? Like, I'll take a vocal opposition over a silent opposition any day. So, it's just kind of staying in relationship. And what I love is they're like, this is their church, and they know it's their church. So I'm glad they're speaking up, and it's an invitation to continue dialogue. And, but also, it's like, okay, if this is what you think, if you think these are partisan political issues that shouldn't be brought up in church, you're speaking out of a political preference, not a spiritual one. So let's have that conversation.
Thank you. I'm seeing the expressions of appreciation in the chat box, and I was going to think of one last question for you, like, where do you see hope or something like that? But you've answered all these questions. I mean, there's just been so much insight and wisdom and positivity and truth in this conversation. I'm really, really grateful for this conversation. But I want to give everybody a chance to say one last thing. How about that? Just whatever you want to say on this topic, or to your community of clergy and preachers and lay people that are watching.
Just for me, oh, hi. I have a guess. Hey, sweetie. Just for me, that white supremacy is so in the fabric and so in everything, the everything of our lives, that one of the things I've had to remember is to constantly remind the folks, as we have this conversation in and out of the pulpit, that when folks come with guilt, when folks come with grief, that all that's normal. But remember, the system is made so that you don't notice this. The system is made so you won't talk. The system is made so that only those with privilege think they're the only ones who can have feelings and feel aggrieved, and so that those who are oppressed don't have any right. You should be grateful. You here. Why are you have something to be upset about? And that is the system. And when we can not make such a difference between the system and people's participation in it, that they can go, well, it's not me, I'm skipping off. But also that I have to break down a system that's so ingrained that it's the water I drink and the air I'm breathing. It's what I'm swimming in. Let us attend to that, as opposed to it's just about my bias. It's just about my action. It's just about my thought. It's about the foundation of our culture, including our churches, and that it didn't get this way in 2 months or a year, and it's not going to undo itself or be undone by anybody in a year or two. It's the whole of the way that we have been for 400 years, and the amount of time it's going to take to look at all of that and to deconstruct it is a serious commitment. And letting ourselves know that, letting our folks know that, letting the world know that this is part of the gospel is part of it's part of that wood that Mother Gayle was talking about. Is that wood we're going to have to look good on. This system is so deeply ingrained that most of us don't know where it begins and where it ends and where we begin. And that bears discussing and discussing and discussing and discussing and discussing.
Thank you.
What gives me hope is what we're doing right now. There's a seat panel that has one white guy on it. That gives me hope. Just one, that's enough. or not me at all, but this is great. It's a change, it's a transition. We need more of this.
Chris just said a seat panel gave him hope. You know, one of the things I think that's remarkable about this moment that I hope people are noticing, it's like the work of church, right, to notice and for preachers to notice, is we're in this upsurge of really powerful memoirs by people of color, and with this honesty, you know, that's back to like Baldwin, right? It's a beautiful moment, and it keeps happening. It's happening all over our communion. It is such a gift, and that part of what that does is break your heart with its, and as Chris said, and as Nikki just said, the emotions we're not supposed to see or have, right? And as a preacher, I think if you are doing your own work, you cannot help but be changed by that kind of work. And again, as Nikki's pointed out, that to be vulnerable enough to say, I can't do this, that my heart is broken right now, and that for us to be human together and to work that into words, which is our task, is all of us growing together. And I think it's a remarkably vulnerable and at times really painful and awkward place to stand. But that work of our own conversion, right, is the work I think that invites other people into a similar space. Your community, Mother Mathis, understands racism in a very different way because of your honesty about what happened to you when that happened to George Floyd, right? And that they are changed by it. You know, and you don't owe it to anyone. You don't have to do it, but what a gift. And I think for all of us, I mean, you would have to be stoned to not be changed by what's happening in our history right now. And if you're not being changed, please go see your therapist, right? Work on it. But I bet you are. And if you can trust your community to be a place that can bear that with you, that might be what you have to offer in this time.
And I just want to remind everybody, this is not easy. This is not easy work. You just can't pray on it and get up in the pulpit on Sunday and start preaching. And so this is an opportunity to reach out to others, to ask for assistance. How do I do this? Let me try this out. We're virtual. Somebody can, record a sermon for you and let that be shown while you're over in the chat section, as Mother Nikki said, asking questions. So this is an opportunity to try things out. And because it doesn't matter how long you've been doing it. Doesn't matter how long you've been preaching it. It is not easy. It is not easy. And so the more we can help each other as a community in this church to really deal with this issue, I think the better off we will be, and we might actually see the promised land before too many of us cross over to that other side, because if we don't, our children will be sitting here 20 years from now, fielding questions to somebody else and going like, well, what happened? And so this is an opportunity for us to really cross those boundaries and to get the help that we need and to know it's not easy. Even for the most polished preacher, it is not easy. But there are folks out here who are willing to assist, help, record, come visit. But this is the opportunity. If we if we miss this opportunity, I don't think we'll get another one. Because it seems like everything is coming together. And as tired as we may be, as fatigued as we may be, there's an opportunity in this chaos to be a different church.
Thank you, Gayle, and thank you, everyone. And on the theme of the community of preachers and the community of Christians is a wonderful way to end, and what we all have to offer each other, and that we're not in this alone, and that we have a lot of work to do, and we can do it together, I think is absolutely right. So I'm grateful to the SEEP Network and Joe Swimmer and the staff there, and for all of you for being here. Thank you to everyone who attended. So thank you all very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Blessings.
Blessings, everybody.
Yes, indeed.